I took 13 different Glock triggers and I had 13 different shooters, rate them across multiple criterias, and what I found was actually quite surprising. So today I'll share with you what was by far the highest rated trigger setup, but actually even more importantly, some very valuable and insightful learnings that will probably save you a lot of money if you're in the market for improving your Glock trigger. Now, there's no lack of Glock trigger reviews here on YouTube, so when I decided I wanted to do one, I wanted to make sure to address one of the key challenges when it comes to this topic, and that is how subjective it seems to be when it comes to what people actually perceive as a good Glock trigger. So many times I've been handed a Glock with promises of this is the most amazing trigger ever made, just to pull it and be like, it's fine. There's also a lot of money in this industry, which attracts companies offering expensive upgrades with fancy branding, often pushed by sponsored shooters and influencers. And I wanted to see whether a blind test would actually prove that these costly upgrades are better, or if simple modifications you can do yourself will perform just as well. So in order to give a proper review of something as subjective as a Glock trigger, I understood that I had to get more people involved because then it would be more likely that the recommendations I do would apply to as many people watching this as possible. What I did is that I had 13 different shooters review the most common triggers that you will find on the market today. All 13 individuals own Glock and shoot Glock pistols, and they are in the category from somewhat experienced up to very experienced shooters. The test I did was a blind test, so there were 13 Glocks on the table and they each had a number on them. And besides the potential differences in the actual trigger shoe, there was no other way of knowing what trigger was in what gun. I was very clear that I only wanted them to rate the triggers by comparing them to other Glock triggers. So I'm not looking for comparing any of the triggers to whatever racing tuned 2011 gun you might have at home. And I also made it clear that they pay no attention to anything else on the gun other than the actual trigger. They were then asked not to discuss in between themselves while the test was ongoing, as I didn't want their opinions to be influenced by other people reviewing the other guns. I then asked them to fill out this form and rate each trigger on a scale from 1 to 5, going from very bad to bad, average, good, and then very good. And I asked them to rate each trigger across 4 different categories. The first being pre-travel, so this is from the moment you start pulling the trigger until you reach the wall, paying attention to how smooth it is, how long it is, and how consistent it feels. Then the trigger break, so the pull from the wall until the trigger breaks, including the actual trigger break, rating how crisp and consistent the break feels, and how you like the trigger weight. And then finally the reset, so from when you start to release the trigger until it resets, rating how long it is, how crisp it is, how distinct and consistent it feels. While these 3 categories offer some depth to the result, the last and most important factor was their overall combined subjective experience of the trigger, and this is also what I used when I rated what were the best overall triggers. The triggers they were asked to test were unmodified standard Glock triggers, unmodified Glock performance triggers, Timney triggers, Apex triggers, Agency Arms triggers, the Johnny Glock trigger, and then different tuned variations of these triggers with different springs, polished or lighter connectors, or different trigger shoes. More interesting than who won the test and what are the top 3 and what should I buy, I think are some of the key learnings and takeaways from this. But we also obviously need to see the top 3 triggers that people thought were the overall best ones. On third place, we surprisingly had the original OEM Glock trigger. Now, this trigger had a really good polishing job that the owner had done himself, and he also had a SEV 3.5 pound disconnector. On second place, we have the Glock performance trigger, and I'll explain this trigger a little bit later, and also with a very good polishing job of the same trigger, and then the SEV 3.5 pound connector. And on first place, actually by a notable amount, we have the Glock performance trigger with the Johnny Glock Vex trigger shoe and the Overwatch NP3 minus connector and the Overwatch NP3 safety plunger. Actually, this is my personal gun, and I was almost hoping that this would not happen as I did not want to be accused for influencing the test in any way. But I can assure you that I do not have any incentive or personal interest in getting you to buy kind of like any specific trigger setup. The only interest I have is to grow my channel here on YouTube, and that can only be done by providing honest and relevant content. So with that in mind, I would appreciate if you hit the subscribe button below if you have made it this far in the video. Back to the result, as there's a lot to unpick here, and we also need to have a look at the combined result of every trigger. But before we do that, let's talk about the 3 triggers that people rated the highest. The first interesting bit is that we do have triggers produced by Glock, taking all of the top 3 places ahead of some much more expensive options at up to 5 times the cost. The top two places were taken by the Glock performance trigger, which is quite different in terms of how it mechanically works versus the other triggers, something I'll explain soon. Also, the trigger that got third place is the standard OEM trigger, so the one that you get out of the box when you buy a new Glock. But the difference with this one was that it had a really good polishing job and a very simple and cheap upgrade with just replacing the connector for a lighter one. So if you're able to polish the trigger yourself, the cost of this setup is less than $20 and is perceived on average as one of the best triggers, even compared to kind of like $400 to $500 setups. But before we look at the remaining list and the conclusions, I also wanted to address one of the important points about how some of these triggers are fundamentally different in how they work. Most of the aftermarket triggers that you'll find on the market today are based on the original design of the standard Glock triggers. The thing about the standard Glock trigger is that the striker is actually not fully cocked after you have racked the slide. It's almost like a kind of like double action trigger, or rather half cocked trigger, if you like. So the first pull of the trigger actually involves fully cocking the firing pin, and then you see this cross shape here that will interact with the firing pin. So once you start pulling the trigger, this will then start pulling the firing pin backwards until the cross then drops down at the end, and then the firing pin will be released forward. So this is also one of the, but not the only reason, while many will say that the Glock have a little bit of a mushy pre-travel and maybe a little bit of a mushy wall, because you're actually interacting with the springs involved to cock the firing pin. Now, you can change springs and you can tune many things to partly get around this problem, or you can do what Timney did a few years ago and create a trigger that changes this by fully cocking the firing pin when the slide cycles. So the Timney triggers became very popular as a result of this, and many thought it kind of like revolutionized the feel of the trigger. At the same time, many, myself included, thought that the reset was not that great, and over time, some of the triggers also started having various issues. Then a couple of years ago, Glock went ahead and released their own performance trigger, building on the same principle of Timney with a fully cocked striker, but with a different approach and design. So they bypassed many of the issues and concerns that people had with the Timney. And the thing is, they also launched the Glock performance trigger at a price that was significantly less than some of the other triggers on the market. And today, at least to my awareness, it's only the Timney and the Glock performance trigger that will fully cock the firing pin when the slide cycles. The exception might be the TriggerTech Ace trigger that you probably shouldn't not buy because it's marketed as a competition trigger, but it's pretty much banned from any relevant competition there is, being IPSC, USPSA, and Steel Challenge. So having said that, if TriggerTech manages to address the safety concerns with the trigger, it does have great potential. But for now, just avoid that trigger. If we now take a look at the highest rated trigger in the test, this was built on the Glock performance trigger. One of the additions that was made was adding the Johnny Glock Vex trigger shoe. So besides the fact that I personally really like the shape of this trigger, as it's kind of flat, but at the same time it's rounded in the edges, the most important part is that you're able to adjust the after travel by a set screw that you see in the back here. So by doing this, you can actually shorten the distance that the trigger will be able to move backwards after the trigger breaks. And by doing that, you will also shorten the reset. So my opinion is that this adds a lot to an already really good performance trigger. So it's important to note that if you search for reviews on this Vex trigger shoe, you'll probably find a few reviews that are not that great. I do want to call out that Johnny Glock just recently updated this trigger, and he addressed some of the issues that has been raised in the past. So the trigger I have here is the new edition, and you can tell by the fact that this does not have a screw to connect it to the trigger bar, but a pin. So if you're considering buying this trigger shoe, make sure that you get the latest one. The only other two additions that were made to this gun was to insert a minus connector. So that's this metal thing here on the side of the trigger house that works together with the trigger bar, and it will influence how heavy the trigger pull is, and to some extent the wall and the brake. In this gun, it was the Overwatch NP3 minus connector, but there are tons of different versions available, including original ones from Glock, and they do come at a fairly low cost. So I'm not saying that you need to get the one from Overwatch, as there's so many alternatives out there. I also changed the safety plunger. That's this small metal thing that sits in the slide and has a little spring behind it. And this is what physically blocks the firing pin to move forward. And it will interact with the trigger so that when you pull the trigger, it will be pushed up and out of the way. And it's this friction then between the trigger bar and safety plunger that we're trying to optimize. This also comes at a fairly trivial cost. And again, there are many other versions available outside the Overwatch NP3 one. And if you wonder what NP3 is, it's just referring to kind of like a special type of coating, like Teflon, but different and apparently really good. As we start to look at the rest of the results, I do want to add that this is not a scientific, peer-reviewed and published research study, and there are variables here that might make some triggers look better or worse than what they actually deserve, and that include the number of rounds that each gun will have fired, as well as other relevant upgrades that you actually do see listed behind each of them. I do think that the Johnny Glock trigger that came in last was hit by this, as it was placed in a gun that had fired less than 100 rounds, and it did not have any other modifications to lighten the spring in the gun. So this is also why I do not recommend this chart as a guide to what triggers to avoid completely, but rather as a good insight trying to draw some valuable conclusions and learnings. So you can pause the screen here if you want to review the details of each trigger individually. So here are some of the key things that I took away from this test. First, Glock triggers are highly subjective. Do not trust what your buddy or favorite gun tuber, myself included, tells you are the best trigger. It's very likely that you're not going to agree once you actually end up testing it. We had different people in this test rate the exact same trigger both as very bad as well as very good. The second one is that expensive doesn't necessarily equal best. A setup that will cost you less than $20 was perceived to be better on average than packages that costs up to $400. So knowing what I know now, and if I was in the market for improving my Glock trigger, I would divide this into two different approaches. So the first approach is if I was on a budget and I wanted to get the maximum value for minimal cost. If so, I'll just keep the original Glock trigger, the one that you get in the box when you buy a gun, but I would buy a lighter connector for it. This is a very cheap upgrade that actually adds a lot. I would then get a solid polishing job, either by a professional gunsmith, a skilled buddy on the range, or by watching any of the countless YouTube tutorials on the subject and just do it myself. It's actually not that difficult. In summary, you could get an excellent trigger for probably less than 20-30 bucks. Now, the second approach would be if I was willing to put more money into it, I would then just purchase the Glock performance trigger. I'll then look into additional upgrades, just like I mentioned, with possibly a lighter connector that's pre-polished, or I would just polish it myself. Personally, I think a trigger shoe with adjustable over travel adds a lot, and while I personally like the shape and feel of the Vex shoe, it will cost you almost as much as the Glock performance trigger itself. And there are also plenty of good other trigger shoes on the market, so it's just about finding the one that you like the best. Also, as mentioned, the safety plunger is a really cheap upgrade that can benefit a little bit on the feel of the trigger. So the complete setup, as is in this gun that people perceive to have the best trigger overall, will cost you about $140 for the performance trigger, $100 for the Vex trigger shoe, $20 for the Overwatch connector, and then $14 for the Overwatch plunger. That's a total of $274 plus potential shipping and tax. So if the almost $300 versus the $30 is worth it, that's basically up to you to decide. Now, what I would probably not do, knowing what I know now, is to invest significant amount of money into any other trigger platform or solution on the market outside the triggers produced by Glock. Not just does people on average seem to like the triggers that Glock produce better and the fact that they come at a significant cheaper cost, but I also feel better knowing that it's the company that produces the gun that has delivered the trigger I have in it. Because for me, reliability and knowing that the gun goes bang when I want it to, and only then, is actually one of the reasons why I'm shooting Glock in the first place. And before you jump into the comments and tell me how whatever trigger you have is the most amazing trigger in the world, and you completely disagree with everything I just said, I'd just like to say that actually you're right, because the best trigger for you is the one that you think is the best one. And what I or anyone else might think is actually not that relevant if you already have something that's working for you. But for the ones looking to invest in a trigger upgrade, I do hope that you got something to think about after having watched this video. And if you did enjoy the video, I would be tremendously happy if you hit the subscribe button below. Thanks for watching.